Somewhere in America right now, a family is signing papers on a home, not renting it, owning it, outright, no 30-year mortgage hanging over their heads. It cost them a fraction of what a house down the street would run. This is the pitch that's pulled in 22 million Americans. Manufactured housing, the last honest rung of the homeownership ladder. Here's what they don't put on the brochure. They own the house. They don't own the ground it's sitting on. And somewhere else in America right now, an investor is running the exact same numbers and smiling, because that gap between the box and the dirt underneath it is the entire business. To understand why this business is so quietly lucrative, you have to understand what it costs to get in. On both sides of the transaction. For the resident, the appeal is simple and real. A manufactured home typically runs somewhere in the tens of thousands of dollars. Compare that to a site-built house in the same town, and it isn't close. No 30-year mortgage. No years of saving for a down payment on land you'll spend decades paying off. For a family working a fixed income, disability payments, or hourly wages, this is often the only door into homeownership that's ever actually open to them. And for a long time, it worked more or less the way it looked like it should. Most parks were small, family-run operations. A husband and wife who lived nearby, who you'd wave to when they collected the rent, who might cut you some slack if you were a little short 1 month. Then somewhere around the last decade, a different kind of buyer noticed something the mom-and-pop owners never fully priced in. Between 2017 and 2019, institutional investors accounted for about 13% of manufactured home park purchases nationwide. By 2020 and 2021, that number had nearly doubled to 23%. Today, 23 private equity firms alone own more than 1,800 parks across the country. That's not a rounding error. That's a full-scale asset class rotation, and it happened almost entirely outside public attention. Because who's paying close attention to trailer parks? The investor side of the barrier to entry looks nothing like the resident side, where a family scrapes together a down payment for a depreciating box. A fund can pick up an entire park, dozens or hundreds of home sites, and the underlying land, often at a price that looks almost absurdly cheap next to an apartment building with the same number of units. Manufactured housing seminars now openly market these parks as a recession-proof alternative asset class. Not a slum, not a liability, an asset class with all the vocabulary that implies: cap rates, cash-on-cash returns, portfolio diversification. So you end up with two very different dreams stacked directly on top of each other. The resident's dream is stability, a home they finally own, free of a landlord's whims. The investor's dream is yield, a boring, overlooked corner of real estate quietly generating returns that outperform flashier assets. Both dreams can be true for a while. But only one side of that deal actually owns the thing that can't be replaced, the ground. So where does the money actually come from? Not from selling anything, not from building anything, from one number, charged every single month, to people who have almost nowhere else to go. Call it layer 1, lot rent. This is the base of the whole structure. The fee a resident pays just to keep their own home sitting on someone else's dirt. It sounds small when you say it fast, a few $100s a month. But multiply that across 200 lots in a single park, and you're looking at a revenue stream that requires almost no ongoing investment to maintain. No renovations to sell. No units to fill with new furniture and staging photos. Just rent, collected month after month, from people who already own the thing sitting on top of it. Layer 2 sits quietly on top of that. Water and sewer service typically gets billed to the park owner by the municipality. A single, wholesale bill for the entire property. The owner then turns around and rebills that cost to residents individually, often folded into the lot rent or tacked on as a separate utility fee. On paper, this looks like a pass-through. In practice, it's a second collection point. And in more than one community, residents have found themselves paying for water they can't even safely drink. Boil water advisories layered on top of the bill, not instead of it. But the real engine, the part that explains why rents climb the way they do, isn't either of those layers. It's the math underneath them. Here's how a park actually gets valued when it sells. Commercial real estate gets priced off something called net operating income. Basically, revenue minus operating costs, divided by a cap rate. And in the mobile home park business, one of the industry's own most prominent investor educators has put a number on exactly what that means in practice. Push lot rents up by $1,000 a month across a property, and at a typical 10% cap rate, you've just added roughly $120,000 to what that park is worth on paper, not to what it costs to run, not to what residents received in exchange for the increase, to the sale price instantly, the moment the rent hike takes effect. Read that again, because it's the whole business model in one sentence. Raising the rent doesn't just generate more monthly cash. It manufactures equity out of nothing, on a schedule the owner controls. Push rents by roughly 10% a year, and you can double them in about 7 years, without adding a single amenity, without fixing a single pothole, without any of the value creation the word investment is supposed to imply. Now put real numbers next to that formula, because the formula stops being abstract fast. In North Liberty, Iowa, a resident named Don Lund moved into the Gulfview community back in 1980, when lot rent ran $87 a month. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $334 in today's money. Already a reasonable, honest number for what it costs to lease a plot of land. By the time a private equity-backed operator had taken over the park, Lund's rent had climbed past $500, not adjusted, not inflated, just raised, notice after notice, on a fixed income that never moved nearly as fast as the number on his bill. Or look at Taunton, Massachusetts, where residents at a park called Boa Vida were paying $302 a month, until a new lease notice arrived proposing $703. That's not a rent increase in any ordinary sense of the phrase. That's a 133% jump, delivered on paper, all at once. The kind of number that reads less like a business decision and more like a test of how much a captive customer will simply absorb. And that's really the question sitting underneath every one of these layers. Lot rent, utility fees, the valuation math that rewards pushing both as hard as possible. None of it works unless residents actually stay and pay it. A normal rental market has an escape valve. If the price gets too high, tenants leave and the landlord eventually feels it. Somewhere in these revenue layers, that escape valve has gone missing. The next section is about exactly where it went, and why the entire pricing model depends on it staying gone. So here's the question that should be bothering you by now. In any normal market, if a landlord pushes rent past what's reasonable, the tenant leaves. They find another apartment, another building, another landlord who wants their business. That threat, the ability to walk, is what keeps prices honest almost everywhere else in the housing market. So why doesn't it work here? The answer is sitting right there in the name, and it's almost funny once you see it. These homes are called mobile, and they are, for all practical purposes, one of the least mobile things a person can own. Moving a manufactured home isn't like moving apartments. It isn't even like moving a car. You need a specialized transport company, permits, a new foundation, and utility hookups waiting on the other end. And critically, a home built recently enough and sturdy enough to survive the trip without cracking apart. All in, that typically runs somewhere between $3,000 and $10,000. And a meaningful share of these homes are old enough or fragile enough that moving them isn't expensive. It's simply not possible. The home stays or the home gets abandoned. Now hold that fact next to the valuation formula from the last section, because this is where the mechanism clicks into place. A rent increase only manufactures free equity if the tenant actually pays it instead of leaving. Normally, that's a real risk for a landlord. Push too hard and the units sit empty. But once moving costs more than most residents can raise on short notice, and once the alternative is abandoning a home they already paid off, that risk basically disappears. The resident isn't choosing between pay the new rent and move somewhere cheaper. They're choosing between pay the new rent and lose the home entirely. That's not a negotiation. That's a toll booth with only one road leading through it. This isn't a side effect the industry stumbled into by accident either. It's taught explicitly as the reason the whole strategy works. One of the field's most prominent investor educators has told other buyers directly, because it costs so much to move a home, residents will tolerate almost any rent increase you put in front of them. That's not a leaked internal memo. That's a sales pitch to other investors, describing captivity as a feature of the asset class. Step back and look at what this actually is. A single mobile home park, once bought, behaves less like an apartment complex and more like a tiny, hyper-local monopoly. Not because the owner cornered the whole regional market, but because each individual resident is already cornered, one household at a time, by the cost of moving a house that was marketed to them as their ticket to independence. The competition that's supposed to discipline pricing in a healthy market never gets a chance to show up. There's nowhere for it to come from. And this is precisely what separates a mobile home park from a lot of other hidden trap businesses. It isn't that overhead quietly eats the margins, and it isn't that a franchisor skims fees off the top. The trap here is priced in before the deal even closes, baked directly into the valuation math, which assumes correctly that the customer cannot leave. The immobility isn't a flaw in the model. It's the entire foundation the model is built on, which raises an uncomfortable question for anyone who owns one of these homes. If you can't leave, and you can't afford to fight, what actually happens next? For the residents you're about to meet, the answer wasn't hypothetical. It played out on their own front doors, in their own mailboxes, one notice at a time. Let's put names to this, because structural trap stays abstract until you see what it looks like on the ground. And one company's name keeps coming up across state lines. Start in Fort Collins, Colorado, at a community called Hickory Village. Before 2021, residents there described rent increases that were modest and predictable, the kind you could plan around. Then the property sold to Haven Park Communities, a Utah-based operator that has grown into one of the largest manufactured housing owners in the country. Within a few years, residents were dealing with boil water advisories on top of rising lot rent. The water contaminated badly enough that the company eventually had to sink more than $800,000 into replacing the distribution system. The rent kept climbing through all of it. Now go north to Billings, Montana, where Haven Park bought a park called Meadowlark in 2020. A resident named Gary Devereaux spent months documenting water coming out of his own faucet the color of coffee, full of sediment. He filed a class action in 2022, and the lawsuit alleged something almost hard to believe, that the company had physically cut the hitches off residents' homes, the very hardware that makes a manufactured home movable at all. Whether or not you believe that detail changes the outcome, think about what it means as a symbol. The one door left open to an unhappy tenant leave was allegedly being welded shut on purpose. Then there's Golfview in North Liberty, Iowa, where we already met Don Lund earlier in this video. He moved in back in 1980, paying $87 a month. He was a quadruple congenital amputee living on Social Security, with no ability to simply go out and earn more when the bills outpaced his income. After Haven Park bought the park in 2019, his rent climbed past $500. Lund kept fighting the increases publicly, kept giving interviews, kept documenting what was happening, right up until he died in 2023, still a resident, still paying. And here's the detail that makes this case study land differently than the others. This exact playbook has even been turned on its own architects. Back in 2015, Frank Rolfe and Dave Reynolds, the two investors whose own valuation math we walked through 2 sections ago, bought a park called North Lamar Community in Austin, Texas. Shortly after the purchase, rents went up and eviction notices went out. Local advocacy groups helped residents organize and sue. The men who wrote the textbook on this business model got named as defendants in a lawsuit built entirely on the mechanism they'd spent years teaching other investors to use. Zoom out, and a pattern emerges that's bigger than any single company. A 2025 review of Florida park sales found that eviction filings jumped 40% in the months immediately following a change in ownership. Not because residents suddenly stopped paying, but because a switch in ownership is usually when the rent math resets hard. Nationally, lot rents in these communities have climbed roughly 45% over the past decade. None of these residents were passive. They organized, they documented water samples, they filed lawsuits, they gave their names to reporters at real risk of retaliation. And in nearly every case, the fight was slow, expensive, and only partially successful. because the law in most states was never built with this specific trap in mind. Which leads to the harder question. If lawsuits mostly slow the bleeding instead of stopping it, is there any version of this fight that actually wins? So who actually wins in the standard version of this business? Not the resident, obviously. And not really the local property manager fielding angry calls about brown water either. The winner is whoever holds the deed, because the entire model is engineered to convert a captive monthly payment into paper equity, year after year, without ever having to compete for a single customer. But here's the twist worth ending on. Because it turns out the trap has an exit, it's just not the one most residents ever hear about. Since 2008, a nonprofit called Ross USA has helped residents at more than 300 parks do something the industry's own playbook never accounted for: buy the land themselves. Residents form a cooperative secure financing and purchase the park outright, converting themselves from tenants into owners of the very ground they'd been paying rent on for years. As of today, not one of those 300-plus cooperatives has ever defaulted or been sold back into private ownership. Not one. And the numbers tell you exactly why the model works. In investor-owned parks, lot rent climbs by an average of about 3.9% a year, comfortably ahead of inflation, right on schedule with the valuation math we walked through earlier. In resident-owned communities, that number drops to roughly 0.9% a year. Some cooperatives have actually pushed rents below market rate. The toll booth doesn't disappear, it just changes owners. Which brings us back to where we started. That family signing papers on a manufactured home isn't wrong to feel like they've bought something real. They have. But what they've bought is a rapidly depreciating box, chained by a few $1,000s of moving costs to a piece of land someone else controls and someone else prices. Ownership in this business was never really about the house. It was always about who owns the dirt underneath it. Everyone else is just paying rent on the ground they're standing on, whether they realize it or not.